Miami glittered like a jewel under the fading sunset, the waves reflecting streaks of gold and coral against the horizon. From the rooftop of the Sterling Towers, the city seemed alive in a way that demanded attention, yet Avery Sinclair hardly noticed. She had come here for one reason: to secure a deal that could change everything. Her heels clicked against the marble floors of the penthouse as she weaved through clusters of Miami's elite, carrying a sleek leather portfolio with the kind of confidence that invited and challenged curiosity. The party was loud. Avery kept her attention on her own mission, sidestepping attempts at idle flirtation from men who thought charm and a private jet were enough to impress her. She didn't need to impress anyone. She needed to be seen by the one person who could actually matter. And then she collided with him. Tall, impossibly well-dressed. The kind of man who commanded attention without a word. Grayson Cole. Avery froze for a split second, her portfolio brushing against his chest, and when she looked up, her breath caught. Not just because he was handsome, but because he looked like someone who could dismantle her defenses with a glance. Dark hair, perfectly groomed, eyes like polished amber, observing everything yet revealing nothing. "You must be Avery Sinclair," he said smoothly, his voice deep, confident, with just a hint of amusement. "Yes," she replied, her own voice steady despite the rush of surprise. "And you are?" "Grayson Cole," he said, extending a hand. His presence was magnetic, the kind that made people lean in without thinking, drawn by the gravity of authority. Avery shook it, firm, cautious, but she couldn't help noticing the subtle pressure of his palm, almost a test of strength and resolve. The music in the room surged, and he leaned closer, almost imperceptibly brushing her side as he spoke, making it impossible to ignore the warmth radiating from him. "I've heard you're not easily impressed," he murmured. There was a challenge in his tone, playful yet commanding. "Impressed is subjective," she replied, tilting her chin with faint defiance. "True," he said, his gaze lingering just long enough to make her pulse quicken. "But I suspect you might be more interesting than most people give themselves credit for." Avery bristled internally. He was confident, too confident, but there was something about the way he carried himself, the quiet dominance beneath the polished charm, that was compelling. She hated to admit it, but she felt that spark. He glanced at her portfolio. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, as if expecting refusal, yet already certain of the answer. "You might find it boring," she said lightly, hiding her instinct to defend it. "Boring is a matter of perspective," he replied, his fingers brushing hers almost accidentally as he reached for the folder. The contact was brief, but the heat it left lingered. Avery swallowed, aware of the small charge between them, but she didn't let it show. For several minutes, they discussed ideas, numbers, and possibilities, each sentence layered with subtle testing. She challenged his assumptions. He countered with effortless logic. He leaned in slightly to whisper a point in her ear, his chest brushing hers, making the space between words feel electric. When she shifted back, pretending to adjust the folder, he leaned a fraction closer, his presence grounding yet thrilling. At one point, as a passing waiter nearly tripped into them, Grayson steadied her by the small of her back, his hand lingering just a heartbeat too long. Avery felt a rush of awareness she hadn't anticipated, but she didn't step away immediately. Something about the controlled confidence of his touch made her hesitate. They moved to a quieter corner of the room, navigating around laughing groups and clinking glasses. Grayson tilted his head toward the balcony, where the Miami skyline sprawled beneath them. "You know," he said, voice lower, "there's something about people who challenge me that I can't resist." Avery raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching in amusement. "I hope that's not a threat," she said, though her voice betrayed a flutter of curiosity she refused to acknowledge. "Depends on your definition of threat," he countered smoothly, stepping slightly closer so that their shoulders brushed. His hand, casual but deliberate, grazed hers as he pointed toward the view. She caught the slight tightening of his fingers around hers, a gesture brief enough to pass unnoticed by anyone else, but deliberate in its effect. Avery felt herself caught in a strange tug-of-war. Every instinct screamed to pull away, yet another part of her, the part that thrived on challenge, wanted to stay, to test this man who was clearly used to controlling every situation, yet found in her a rare defiance. They spoke about trivialities then, laughter interspersed with pointed jabs. He teased. She parried. Every brush of his hand, every subtle shift in stance, seemed orchestrated to provoke a reaction, and she found herself responding in ways she hadn't expected. She caught herself glancing at his mouth, noticing the subtle curve of his lips when he smirked. At one point, as they laughed over a particularly daring remark she'd made about a mutual acquaintance, he pressed her gently against the balcony wall, not roughly, but enough that she felt the heat of his body along hers. "And yet, you still managed to surprise me," he whispered, letting his hand brush along hers as if accidental. The effect was immediate. Her pulse spiked, her thoughts scattered, yet she maintained a composed exterior. "Careful," she said, playful yet warning. "You're treading dangerous ground." Grayson's amber eyes sparkled. "Maybe that's the point," he replied, letting his thumb brush her knuckles before releasing her hand. The night deepened, the party continuing around them, but the rest of the world seemed to blur. Avery noticed everything: the faint scent of his cologne, the casual confidence in the way he adjusted his cufflinks, the subtle power in every gesture. She was aware of the soft press of his arm along hers as they navigated the crowd, and though her mind tried to catalog his charm analytically, her body betrayed a different, more visceral reaction. For the first time in a long while, Avery felt herself drawn to someone who wasn't just another face in the crowd, someone who could see through her defenses without trying to conquer them outright. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of challenge, allure, and unspoken understanding. Finally, as the party reached a quieter lull, Grayson leaned slightly closer, his voice low and intimate. "I think this is just the beginning of something interesting," he said, the heat in his tone undeniable. Avery smiled, part caution, part curiosity. "Interesting is subjective," she reminded him, though her heart raced. "Perhaps," he replied, letting his hand graze hers briefly in a casual farewell, the contact lingering long enough to make her aware of his presence even as he stepped back. "But I think we'll define it together." She watched him move through the crowd, every step confident, every glance calculated yet magnetic. And though she wouldn't admit it aloud, Avery felt a thrill of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. In Grayson Cole, she had met an equal, someone who was as challenging as he was compelling. And deep down, she knew this encounter would change everything. The Miami skyline sparkled below, and Avery took a slow, steadying breath. One thing was certain: she wasn't ready to let him go. The following week, Miami seemed smaller, somehow compressed around Avery Sinclair's world. Her days were no longer hers alone. They had become a delicate balance between her ambition and the unexpected gravitational pull of Grayson Cole. She had tried to dismiss him after that first encounter, labeling him as just another charismatic distraction. But every time she closed her eyes, she felt the ghost of his presence, the warmth of a hand brushing hers, the subtle challenge in his amber gaze. Her office, a sunlit space overlooking Biscayne Bay, was alive with the hum of her team preparing a proposal for a new project she had been developing for months. Avery adjusted the sleek leather straps of her portfolio, mentally rehearsing her pitch, unaware that the day had already been claimed by a visitor she could not ignore. A sharp rap on the glass door announced him before he even entered. "Good morning, Avery," Grayson said, leaning casually in the doorway. His tailored suit was impeccable as always, but there was a relaxed ease about him today, a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. He held a tablet in one hand, the other brushing casually along the doorframe, close enough that she felt a prick of awareness at his proximity. "You're early," she said, keeping her tone neutral. Yet her pulse betrayed her calm exterior. "I like to be efficient," he replied, stepping fully inside. His presence seemed to take up more space than the room could allow, yet he didn't overwhelm. He offered a small smile, watching her straighten the papers on her desk. "I read through your initial projections. Impressive work." Avery lifted an eyebrow. "I assume you didn't come here just to compliment me." "No, I didn't," he said smoothly, moving closer to examine the schematics laid out on the desk. As he leaned over, his hand brushed against hers, not accidental, but fleeting, just long enough to make her aware of the warmth. Avery drew back slightly, yet found herself curious, compelled to maintain eye contact instead of retreating. "You work quickly," Grayson observed, tilting his head. "Focused." I like that. And you like control, she countered, a trace of amusement in her voice. I'm aware of your type. His smirk was slow, deliberate. Perhaps. Or perhaps I like results, and people who can keep up. He moved behind her as she turned the pages, his hand hovering near the small of her back for a fleeting moment as he gestured to a chart. The contact was subtle, but unmistakable, and it sent a ripple of awareness through her. Avery clenched her jaw slightly, trying not to betray the quickening of her pulse. They spent the morning reviewing projections, debating methodologies, and challenging assumptions. Every time Avery made a point, Grayson leaned just a bit closer, his presence a constant pressure against her periphery. When she stood to retrieve another document, he reached out, lightly touching her elbow to guide her through the narrow space between the desks. The contact was casual, yet it left an indelible trace on her senses. By midday, they had moved their discussion to a nearby cafe overlooking the marina. The outdoor terrace offered privacy among the bustling cityscape. Grayson seated himself opposite her, but as she adjusted her chair, he reached across the table, lightly taking her hand. I want to make sure we're aligned, he said softly. The touch was brief, almost imperceptible to anyone else, yet Avery felt it all the same. A mix of reassurance, subtle authority, and unspoken challenge. She withdrew her hand, placing it over the cup of coffee as a shield. Aligned in what way? She asked cautiously, yet there was a flutter of anticipation beneath her words. In all ways that matter, he replied, a faint smile playing on his lips. His amber eyes locked onto hers, measuring, assessing, and daring her to respond. Avery's heartbeat accelerated, and for a moment, she almost laughed at herself for letting a simple touch have such an effect. The afternoon passed in a series of deliberate interactions, each charged with an undercurrent of tension. In the lab, as Avery demonstrated a prototype device, Grayson moved behind her to adjust a piece of equipment. His hand brushed her lower back lightly, steadying her as she leaned forward. She froze, aware of the nearness, the warmth, and the subtle electric charge that seemed to vibrate between them. She focused on her task, forcing herself to channel the rising tension into concentration. Careful, he said in a low voice, right next to her ear. I wouldn't want anything to distract you from this. I can handle distractions, she whispered, though she knew she wasn't being entirely truthful. The brief graze of his arm along hers had left her heart racing, her mind momentarily scattered. Later, as they walked through the corridor to inspect another section of her project, the space narrowed. Grayson's hand brushed hers again, this time deliberately taking her fingers in a gentle grip. Avery resisted the urge to pull away, noting the strength and warmth in his touch, the subtle but firm assurance that he wasn't letting go. She matched his pace, her steps measured, aware of every subtle movement, every glance that lingered a second too long. You seem persistent, he commented lightly, his thumb brushing against hers as they walked. The words were casual, but there was an edge in his tone that suggested observation, challenge, and a hidden compliment all at once. I have to be, she replied evenly, keeping her gaze forward. Yet inside, her pulse thrummed erratically, betraying her careful facade. By evening, they returned to her office to wrap up. The sky outside was painted with shades of deep orange and violet. The city's lights began to flicker on, reflecting in the glass walls around them. Grayson stepped closer to hand back a set of notes, his hand lightly brushing her shoulder, then lingering near the small of her back as she leaned to take them. Avery felt her breath catch, a strange mix of irritation and thrill. Do you ever stop? She asked, her tone teasing, though her cheeks betrayed the heat she felt. For you, he replied smoothly, his amber eyes locked on hers, daring her to challenge him further. I could keep going all night. Avery smiled faintly, resisting a shiver. You're relentless. Not relentless, he said, tilting his head. Focused. Intentional. The weight of his words lingered long after the physical contact ended. Every brush of skin, every subtle gesture, had been deliberate, yet he maintained an elegant restraint. It was infuriating and intoxicating all at once. Avery felt caught in a dance she hadn't agreed to join, yet couldn't seem to resist. As Grayson finally prepared to leave, he lingered in the doorway, a shadow framed by the glow of city lights. We'll reconvene tomorrow, he said, a promise as much as a statement. I think we're going to make a good team. Avery nodded, attempting to mask the rapid pulse in her chest. We'll see, she said, trying to sound detached. He smiled, the kind that suggested both admiration and challenge. We will, he said softly, turning to leave, but not before his hand grazed hers again in parting. A light, almost casual contact that sent an unexpected shiver through her. Alone, Avery exhaled slowly, sinking into her chair. The day had been exhausting, productive, and unsettling. Grayson Cole had found a way to infiltrate her carefully maintained defenses, not with force, but with proximity, touch, and presence. She clenched her fists briefly, recalling every accidental touch, every brush of his hand, every glance that lingered too long. Somewhere in the midst of technical discussions, strategic planning, and professional collaboration, a line had been crossed, one that she wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. And yet, she couldn't deny the anticipation that hummed through her, the curious thrill that came with every thought of him. Grayson Cole had entered her world, not as an intruder, but as a force that demanded attention, respect, and perhaps something more. Avery leaned back, closing her eyes, allowing herself a brief moment of acknowledgement. She was aware, and she knew, deep down, that the days ahead would be a careful, deliberate dance between control and surrender, and that she had no idea who would lead. The Miami sun had barely risen when Avery Sinclair stepped into her office, the light catching the glass and steel of her CityView workspace. She hadn't slept well, her mind buzzing with plans, calculations, and, unexpectedly, thoughts of Grayson Cole. The previous day's interactions lingered like an electric current, subtle touches, fleeting brushes of skin, the way he had guided her hand across documents, the heat that had flared whenever he had leaned close. She scolded herself quietly. Focus on the work, Avery. He was a distraction. Yet the moment Grayson arrived, without knocking, as usual, leaning casually against the doorway, her pulse betrayed her attempts at discipline. Morning, he said, his voice low, smooth, carrying that mix of confidence and charm that seemed to cling to him like a second skin. His tailored suit was impeccable, but he seemed relaxed, natural, effortless. You're early, Avery replied, adjusting her blazer, a little more aware than she wanted to be of his presence so close behind her. I like efficiency, he said, stepping fully inside, the faintest brush of his shoulder along hers as he passed. Avery's breath caught. The movement had been incidental, or so he wanted her to believe, but the effect lingered. They reviewed the latest phase of her project, but today, there was more than technical discussion. There was an unspoken tension, a heightened awareness of each other. When she leaned over the table to check a diagram, Grayson stepped behind her, lightly resting a hand on her lower back, not to steady her, but close enough that she felt the heat of his body press lightly against hers. She straightened with a slight inhale, her mind immediately jumping to thoughts she wasn't prepared to acknowledge. You're persistent, she said lightly, trying to mask the awareness of his proximity. He chuckled softly, leaning closer so that his chest nearly brushed hers. I prefer intentional, he murmured, his voice low enough that it vibrated against her ear. Avery swallowed, trying to maintain her composure, but the quickening of her pulse betrayed her calm exterior. Hours passed in this delicate dance, collaboration tinged with tension. He would hand her notes, their fingers brushing. He would guide her through narrow spaces, his hand resting lightly on her waist or elbow. Avery found herself consciously moving closer to him at times, drawn by instinct, challenged by awareness. She scolded herself mentally with each subtle thrill that surged through her. By midday, a meeting at an external site became unavoidable. They drove together, side by side in Grayson's sleek black SUV. The city raced past in a blur of light and color, but inside, the vehicle seemed suspended in a private, tense bubble. At one point, as they navigated a narrow street with traffic closing in, he reached over and lightly grasped her hand. Here, he said simply. Steady. The contact was casual, practical even, but Avery felt her heart thrum, the warmth of his palms searing against hers. She looked at him, eyes wide for a moment, but he didn't flinch or look away. His gaze was steady, intense, unflinching. In that silence, something shifted, An unspoken acknowledgement of connection, a recognition neither wanted to name aloud. At the site, a minor mishap with a piece of equipment threatened to ruin hours of planning. Avery, frustrated and flustered, stepped back instinctively, but Grayson was there instantly. One hand braced against the console beside her, the other lightly gripping her upper arm to guide her out of harm's way. Close enough that she could feel the heat of his chest near hers. She froze for a fraction of a second, aware of the magnetic pull that seemed to tether them together. "You okay?" he asked softly, his face inches from hers. "Ah, yes. Fine," she stammered, aware of her own shaky breath. His proximity was maddeningly intimate, and yet the steadiness in his touch and gaze offered reassurance. For a fleeting moment, Avery considered letting herself relax completely, to acknowledge the pull that had been growing over the past days. Instead, she straightened, attempting a composed posture. "Thank you," she said evenly, though her voice lacked the usual edge. "Anytime," he replied, his thumb brushing her forearm lightly as he released her. It was brief, casual, yet potent, an assertion of presence, of connection. Avery caught her breath, blinking rapidly as he stepped back. The day continued, and with it, a growing sense of intimacy. In meetings, during walks between buildings, and while reviewing notes in quiet corners, Grayson's gestures were deliberate yet subtle. A guiding hand on her back, a reassuring squeeze of her wrist, a brush of fingers against hers when passing documents. Avery found herself acutely aware of each touch, the way his movements conveyed confidence and care simultaneously. By the late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, painting the city in shades of fire and rose, they returned to her office to debrief. Avery was exhausted, both from work and from the tension simmering beneath every interaction. Grayson remained standing near her desk, leaning casually, observing her as she typed, his presence a constant, quiet gravity. "I think you're enjoying this collaboration more than you're willing to admit," he said, his tone teasing, yet soft. His fingers brushed hers as he passed a folder, deliberately lingering. "I'm enjoying the results," she replied, her voice firm, though her pulse betrayed her. He smiled faintly, moving closer as she sorted papers, positioning himself just behind her. The heat of his body pressed lightly against hers, his hand near her waist, not touching unless she allowed it. Avery exhaled slowly, aware of the nearness, the unspoken tension. "Focused," he murmured, almost to himself. "Intentional." She turned slightly to glance at him, caught between irritation and attraction. "You're infuriating," she said lightly, though her lips curved into a small, reluctant smile. "Not infuriating," he corrected softly, letting his hand brush hers again briefly. "Necessary." The office was quiet now, the city humming below. Avery leaned back, finally allowing herself a private acknowledgement. She was aware, fully aware. Grayson Cole had infiltrated the boundaries she carefully maintained, and she was both terrified and exhilarated. The day had been about work, but the undercurrent of physical closeness, attention, and subtle dominance had carved out a space she couldn't ignore. Finally, he straightened, preparing to leave. "Tomorrow, we continue," he said softly, brushing a hand lightly against the small of her back as he passed her. Avery didn't step back. Instead, she felt a faint thrill of anticipation, an acknowledgement of what had been growing between them over these days. Alone, Avery sank into her chair, exhaling slowly. She replayed every touch, every glance, every near-casual brush of his hand, and realized something undeniable. The man was relentless, intentional, and captivating. She was drawn to him, despite every protest her mind tried to muster. For the first time in a long while, she felt the tension of attraction that was not merely physical but electric, charged with intellect, challenge, and the possibility of something neither of them were ready to define. And she knew, with an uneasy thrill, that the days ahead would demand careful navigation, through work, tension, and the slow burn of emotions that neither could fully ignore. Grayson Cole had become more than a distraction. He had become a force, one Avery wasn't sure she could resist. The evening air in Miami was thick with humidity, carrying the faint scent of the ocean mingled with exhaust from the city streets. Avery Sinclair stood on the balcony of her apartment, the lights of the skyline reflecting in her eyes, thoughts of the day's events consuming her. She hadn't expected the stress, the pressure of deadlines, or the relentless tension between work and something far more potent, Grayson Cole. The knock on her door was soft but deliberate. She straightened, her pulse quickening in anticipation. "May I come in?" Grayson's voice was calm, confident, carrying that signature blend of authority and allure. Avery's lips parted slightly, betraying her surprise despite her effort to remain composed. "You just left my office hours ago," she said, trying to sound mildly exasperated. "I needed to see you," he said simply, stepping inside. There was no hesitation, no question, just presence. He moved toward her, the kind of measured, controlled approach that demanded awareness. As he reached her, he stopped a mere step away, close enough that the heat from his body brushed hers. Avery's breath caught, and she forced herself to focus on something tangible, the skyline, the railing, anything but him. "You know," he murmured, leaning slightly, the angle intimate, his voice low, "I don't like leaving things unresolved." "Grayson," she began, exhaling sharply, knowing that word alone could not convey her growing apprehension. He stepped just a fraction closer, until the space between them seemed charged, almost electric. His hand moved toward hers, brushing it gently, then holding it with a firm but considerate grip. Avery felt her pulse spike, the warmth from his touch spreading along her arm. She didn't pull away this time. Instead, she allowed the contact, letting herself register the sensation fully. "You've been on my mind," he said softly. "All day." Avery's chest tightened. Her rational mind screamed to maintain composure, but every fiber of her body responded to him. She looked up into his amber eyes, seeing more than confidence there. There was intensity, care, and a vulnerability he rarely displayed publicly. "Grayson, this is complicated," she admitted, her voice low, tremulous with emotion she didn't usually allow herself to express. "Life is complicated," he replied gently, stepping even closer so that their foreheads almost touched. "But some things are worth it." His hand moved from hers to the small of her back, a firm yet gentle anchor. Avery's knees felt slightly unsteady, but she didn't step back. She allowed herself to feel, to acknowledge the tension building between them. In a swift, deliberate motion, he tilted her chin upward, studying her face as if memorizing it. "You challenge me," he said. "Not just your intellect, but your heart, your will, everything about you." Avery swallowed hard, realizing that the flutter in her stomach wasn't nerves, it was desire. "And you?" she whispered. "You're dangerous." He smiled faintly, that signature smirk that both infuriated and captivated. "Perhaps, but only to those who let me in." Their proximity was intoxicating. Grayson's hand lingered at her waist, the warmth and solidity a stark contrast to her own control and independence. Avery felt herself lean into him slightly, drawn despite herself, aware that this moment was a precipice she hadn't intended to approach. Then, as if reading her hesitation, he closed the distance completely, pressing his lips gently to hers. It was brief but electrifying, a soft, exploratory kiss that left her breathless and grounded all at once. Avery's hands instinctively went to his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, the tension of his muscles beneath the fabric of his shirt. The kiss deepened, lingering longer this time, a slow exploration rather than a hurried encounter. When they finally parted, Avery's forehead rested against his, her breaths mingling with his. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Then don't," he whispered, capturing her hand and pressing it against his chest. "Feel this. Feel us." The hours slipped away as they stood there, the city lights painting shadows across their faces. Conversations melted into whispers, touches into lingering caresses, and with each movement, Avery found herself surrendering more, not entirely, but enough to trust, enough to acknowledge the depth of her feelings. Later, as they finally sat on the couch in her apartment, a new intensity framed their interactions. He pulled her into a careful embrace, one hand at her back, the other tracing light patterns along her arm. Avery rested her head against his shoulder, feeling a combination of safety and exhilaration. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she confessed softly, the weight of honesty in her words. "You don't have to be ready," Grayson replied. "You just have to be here." Their closeness was undeniable, a perfect balance between restraint and desire. Grayson's fingers occasionally grazed her hair or her wrist, subtle gestures that spoke louder than words ever could. Avery felt herself relaxing into him, letting go of the constant guard she had maintained for years. And though her mind catalogued every sensation, every small gesture, her heart simply surrendered to the moment. The next morning brought new challenges. The project they had been developing faced unexpected scrutiny, competitors attempting to undermine their progress, deadlines that seemed impossible, and whispers of internal resistance. Avery and Grayson confronted the situation side by side, their professional synergy amplified by the trust that had begun to form in their personal interactions. During a particularly tense moment, Avery's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted equipment. Grayson noticed instantly, and without hesitation, took her hand in his, steadying her. The touch was brief but intimate, a reminder that he was there, always present, always attentive. Avery caught his gaze and held it, realizing that the tension she had felt before had transformed into something deeper: connection, reliance, and burgeoning affection. As they left the building that evening, walking side by side through the warm Miami night, Grayson slipped his hand into hers. Avery's heart raced, but this time, she didn't pull away. The city lights reflected in the water below, and for the first time in months, Avery felt entirely seen by a man who matched her mind, her strength, and her fire. "I think this," Grayson said softly, intertwining his fingers with hers, "is only the beginning." Avery smiled, leaning slightly into him. "Then let's see where it goes." They walked in silence, the unspoken understanding between them heavier and more intimate than words could convey. For Avery, every brush of his hand, every protective gesture, every lingering look had transformed the dynamic between them. She was no longer just aware. She was engaged, emotionally invested, and, despite herself, beginning to desire the very intensity she had resisted for so long. By the time they parted at her door, the night had shifted. Grayson pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, a soft acknowledgement of both restraint and longing. Avery felt a shiver run through her, a mixture of anticipation and nervous excitement. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we continue." "Yes," she whispered, voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "We continue." Alone, Avery sank against her door, replaying every touch, every glance, every whispered word. She realized that she had crossed a threshold, one she had feared but now embraced. Grayson Cole was no longer a distraction. He was a force in her life, a presence she could no longer ignore, and a man who had begun to dismantle the carefully constructed walls she had built around her heart. And in that quiet moment, Avery understood that the story between them was only just beginning. A story defined not by hesitation, but by courage, connection, and the irresistible tension that had drawn them together from the very first encounter. Miami was simmering under an intense heat wave, the city buzzing with the kind of tension that made nerves fray and tempers shorten. Avery Sinclair's office felt unusually oppressive, though the source of the tension wasn't the summer sun. It was the email that had just appeared on her laptop, threatening to undo weeks of work. A rival company had leaked information about her project, attempting to sabotage the funding, and the deadline to respond was immediate. She ran her fingers through her hair, exhaling sharply. The moment of panic was interrupted by the familiar, calm presence at her doorway. Grayson Cole leaned casually against the frame, arms crossed, observing her with a faint smile that was both reassuring and mischievous. "Trouble?" he asked, though the sharpness in his gaze betrayed the seriousness. "Yes," Avery said bluntly, pushing her chair back. "They're trying to derail everything. We have less than 24 hours to respond." Grayson stepped inside without hesitation. "Then we fight back," he said simply, moving toward her desk. His proximity immediately sent a ripple of warmth through her. He leaned over her, guiding her fingers across the screen to point out inconsistencies, brushing lightly against her side as he did. Avery's breath hitched slightly, aware of the electric tension between them even in the midst of crisis. Hours passed in a blur of strategy, late-night emails, and urgent calls. At one point, Avery had to step back from the desk, overwhelmed by the pressure. Grayson followed, instinctively placing a hand on her waist to steady her. She inhaled sharply at the contact, noticing the firm warmth of his body against hers. His eyes met hers, steady and intense, silently asking if she could trust him, and she did, completely. "You're incredible under pressure," he murmured, his thumb brushing lightly across her wrist. Avery tried to focus on the screen in front of her, but the closeness, the warmth, the subtle intimacy of his gestures distracted her more than she cared to admit. "I couldn't do it without you," she whispered back, not entirely sure if she was referring to the project or to him. As the night deepened, exhaustion began to set in. Avery's hands shook slightly as she tried to organize data, and Grayson immediately reached over, taking her hand gently, pressing it to calm her. His touch was grounding, intimate, and a silent promise. She was not alone in this fight. "You need to rest for a moment," he said softly, guiding her to the couch. Before she could protest, he pulled her into a careful embrace, one hand at the small of her back, the other tracing a line along her arm. Avery's resistance faltered. She leaned into him slightly, the comfort and safety he provided conflicting with the desire that had been building between them for days. "I can't just stop," she murmured, tilting her head up to meet his eyes. "You can," he countered softly, tilting her chin with a finger. "You just need to let me help." His amber gaze locked onto hers with a rare vulnerability that made her heart ache. She allowed herself to relax against him, letting go of some of the tension she had been carrying. The moment stretched, intimate, and charged. Grayson's hand lingered at her waist, his other fingers brushing along her arm. Avery felt the intensity of their connection, something deeper than attraction, stronger than simple desire. It was care, trust, and unspoken understanding rolled into one. Suddenly, a notification alert pulled them back to reality, an update on the sabotage attempt. Avery grabbed her laptop, and Grayson hovered close, one hand brushing hers as they worked. Their fingers met, interlaced briefly, then lingered, a silent acknowledgement of the growing intimacy and reliance between them. Hours later, as dawn crept over the Miami skyline, they leaned back in exhaustion and relief. The immediate crisis had passed. Their response had neutralized the sabotage, the project safe for now. Avery looked at Grayson, noticing the dark circles under his eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the way his presence seemed inseparable from her own sense of calm and accomplishment. "You stayed all night," she said softly, her voice betraying a mix of admiration and something more intimate. "I stayed because you needed me," he replied, his tone gentle yet possessive. He moved closer, his hand brushing hers, fingers curling slightly over hers. Avery's pulse quickened at the deliberate intimacy. "I don't know how to thank you," she murmured, leaning back slightly, though the movement brought her closer to him. "Don't," he said, his voice low and soft. "Actions speak louder than words." And with that, he leaned down, pressing a deep, lingering kiss to her lips. This one wasn't tentative. It was deliberate, passionate, conveying everything that had been simmering between them: tension, desire, care, and an unspoken promise. Avery responded instinctively, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer, matching the intensity with equal fervor. When they finally parted, breaths heavy and uneven, Avery rested her forehead against his. "Grayson, this is," she began, searching for words. "Exactly what it should be," he whispered, capturing her hand and pressing it to his chest. "No hesitation, no doubt. Just trust." Avery exhaled slowly, allowing herself a rare vulnerability. She felt safe, exhilarated, and undeniably drawn to him. Every brush of his fingers, every protective gesture, every whispered word had built an intimacy she couldn't ignore. The night stretched into morning, but neither moved away. They sat close, intertwined in thought and quiet conversation, the city awakening below. Avery realized, with a quiet, electrifying certainty, that Grayson Cole had become indispensable, not just in her work, but in her life, her heart, and her world. And she was ready, for the first time, to allow herself to feel it fully, to risk, to trust, and to embrace the intensity that he brought into her life. The Miami sky was ablaze with sunset hues, streaks of amber and rose reflecting off the bay as Avery Sinclair stepped onto the terrace of Grayson Cole's penthouse. She had never felt so acutely aware of her own heartbeat, strong, steady, yet quickened by anticipation. Tonight wasn't about work, meetings, or deadlines. Tonight was about them. About the connection that had built over days of challenges, tension, and undeniable desire. Grayson was already there, leaning casually against the glass railing, his amber eyes catching the dying light of the sun. He turned as she approached, a smile spreading across his face that made her pulse stutter. "There you are," he said softly. "I was wondering how long it would take you to arrive." "You know I can't be late," Avery replied, though she allowed a playful lift to her tone, a rare display of levity. She noticed the tailored suit he wore, perfectly cut, the subtle cologne she had come to recognize and crave, and the way his presence seemed to command the space around him. "You're right," he said, stepping closer, the heat of his body brushing hers as he closed the small distance between them. "And I like punctuality, especially when it brings you here." Avery swallowed hard, feeling the familiar surge of anticipation and thrill that had followed him since their first encounter. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers effortlessly. The touch was gentle yet deliberate, conveying a promise, a connection, and a certainty she hadn't allowed herself to admit before. "I've been thinking," he said, his thumb tracing light circles over the back of her hand, "about everything we've been through these past weeks. The challenges, the late nights, the intensity." His voice was low, intimate, each word weighted with sincerity. "And I realize that I don't want this to end. Not the partnership, not us." Avery felt warmth spread across her chest. She had tried to maintain distance, to protect herself from the allure of a man who was as commanding as he was magnetic. Yet here he was, standing close, touching her, grounding her while igniting a fire she had no intention of denying. "Grayson, She paused, catching her breath as his other hand reached up, cupping her cheek with tender insistence. "You don't have to speak," he said softly, leaning in to brush his lips against hers. This kiss was slow, deliberate, a culmination of everything between them: tension, desire, care, and mutual respect. Avery melted into the contact, her arms winding around his neck, pulling him closer, feeling the strength and warmth of his embrace. When they parted, their foreheads pressed together, breaths mingling. Avery realized she had never felt so completely seen. "I've never," she murmured, searching for words. "I've never felt like this before." "I know," he whispered. "Neither have I." His fingers traced down her arm to her hand, holding it firmly, possessively, yet with tenderness. "But I do now, and I want to see where this goes, with you." The city lights below blinked on one by one, the skyline glittering like 1,000 tiny promises. Avery let herself relax against him, leaning into the strength she had come to trust. "Then we'll see where it goes," she said softly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Together, they spent the evening on the terrace, talking in low voices, laughing quietly, and sharing stories beyond work and ambition. For the first time, Avery allowed herself to explore the softer edges of her personality, and Grayson matched her openness with genuine attentiveness. Every glance, every subtle touch, every brush of a finger reinforced the bond they had cultivated through tension, challenge, and intimacy. At one point, Grayson wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close as they watched the moon rise over the water. Avery rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, the warmth of his body radiating into hers. "This feels right," she whispered. "It is right," he said, pressing a soft kiss to the top of her head. "And it will only get better." Later, as they moved inside to the living room, the intimacy between them deepened naturally. They shared another kiss, longer this time, their hands exploring lightly, with mutual respect and passion. Avery traced the contours of his face, memorizing every detail she had secretly admired: the strong jawline, the warm amber eyes, the subtle smile that could disarm and captivate simultaneously. Grayson, in turn, held her close, letting his hands move along her back, her waist, and shoulders with gentle precision, each gesture a promise and affirmation. They talked late into the night, sharing hopes, fears, and small secrets they had reserved for no one else. Avery realized that the attraction that had begun with flirtation and tension had transformed into something deeper: trust, care, and a love that had grown through challenges rather than despite them. Eventually, exhaustion settled in, and they remained close, bodies pressed together in a comfortable, natural embrace. Avery allowed herself to finally surrender fully to the intimacy, feeling safe, cherished, and exhilarated all at once. The physical closeness mirrored the emotional bond that had grown over weeks of shared trials and tender moments, solidifying their connection in a way neither had anticipated but both welcomed. Before she drifted off, Avery whispered, "I think I'm ready for this. For us." Grayson pressed a final, lingering kiss to her lips, a seal on their journey so far. "And I'm ready too," he said softly. "Always." The Miami night stretched on around them, the city alive with possibility. Avery realized that life with Grayson Cole was not just exciting and intense. It was real, balanced with trust, mutual respect, and undeniable passion. They had faced external pressures, professional challenges, and personal hesitations, and yet here they were, stronger together than apart. In that moment, Avery understood something profound. Love wasn't just about desire or fleeting attraction. It was about partnership, trust, courage, and the willingness to be vulnerable with someone who would meet you halfway. And with Grayson, she had found all of that and more. The weeks that followed solidified their bond. They worked side by side, blending ambition and passion seamlessly. They laughed, challenged each other, and explored the depth of their connection, both emotional and physical. Avery's independence remained intact, but now it existed alongside a partnership that amplified her strengths rather than constrained them. One evening, as they watched the sunset from Grayson's terrace, Avery leaned into him, her hand entwined with his. "Do you think it was always meant to be like this?" she asked, a soft smile playing on her lips. Grayson wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "I don't know about fate," he replied, "but I do know that everything led us here, and I wouldn't change a thing." Avery rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. For the first time in years, she felt truly complete, seen, cherished, and fully alive. The city sprawled below them, but all that mattered was the warmth, connection, and love that existed right here, between them. Grayson leaned down, capturing her lips in a soft, lingering kiss. Avery responded with equal tenderness, their hearts and minds finally synchronized, their bond unbreakable. In that kiss, in that embrace, the weeks of tension, challenge, flirtation, and growing trust culminated in a perfect, unspoken promise. Together, they could face anything. And as the night deepened, Avery Sinclair and Grayson Cole stood together, intertwined physically and emotionally, ready to embrace the future, one full of love, passion, mutual respect, and endless possibility.